All right, so we're diving deep today into Matthew 14:22 to 33.
The story of Jesus walking on water.
You know it,
Everyone knows this one.
but we're going deeper than the usual, Sunday school stuff.
Right.
We've got a whole bunch of sermons on this from pastors.ai. And I got to say, some of these were really eye-opening.
It's interesting how many different ways, even a familiar theme, like,
Yeah.
Focusing on Jesus during the storms, how many ways that can be interpreted.
Yeah.
Some really unique takes.
Yeah, like this whole concept of distracted commitment that one pastor talked about,
Oh, yeah?
that really resonated with me. It's not that we're not committed,
Right.
but it's like the distractions.
Yeah.
Almost like the devil is throwing them at us
Right.
to make our faith ineffective.
It's interesting how that connected to, in a couple of different sermons, the idea of blinders, like a horse with blinders on, to keep its focus straight ahead.
Right.
Talking about spiritual blinders, so we can keep our eyes on Jesus and not get distracted by all the stuff the world throws at us.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
Blinders.
Yeah.
It makes you think about all the things that we let distract us.
Yeah.
Worries,
It's
anxieties.
just the busyness of life.
Yeah, the constant information.
Yeah, absolutely.
And no wonder we sometimes feel like we're sinking,
Right.
just like Peter did.
When he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and even that, several pastors pointed out that he started strong.
Yeah.
He was walking on the water. But then as soon as he focused on the wind and the waves, his faith wavered.
Yeah.
So it's powerful where we choose to put our attention.
For sure. And then there's that whole theme of stepping out of the boat, literally and metaphorically.
Yeah.
So many of the pastors were talking about taking that bold step,
Yeah.
even when it feels risky.
Yeah.
Like the boat might feel safe, but it's also not where the miracles happen.
One pastor even went so far as to say that the whole story is an analogy for how Jesus launched the church.
Sending us out into the world. We face storms, but we're empowered by his presence.
I love that. It's like we're called to do the impossible,
Yeah.
but that means facing some storms.
Yeah.
But, if we have Jesus, we can walk on water, so to speak.
Right. Speaking
Yeah.
of analogies, one pastor used snowboarding.
Okay.
You got to keep your focus on a fixed point as you're going down the mountain.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus as you go through all the challenges of life.
That's great.
Yeah.
Really relatable.
Yeah. Especially for younger generations.
Yeah.
Take something familiar and uses it to explain a deeper truth.
I'm stealing that one.
And then there's this really intriguing theme that came up, the idea of faith in the midst of chaos.
Okay.
This is where things got kind of deep. A few pastors tied in the chaos of the sea with the Hebrew phrase tohu wabohu from Genesis, formless and void.
Oh, right.
So
they're saying Jesus intentionally leads us into chaotic situations. That's kind of a head scratcher, right? But the way they explained it was sometimes Jesus brings us into the chaos because that's where we learn to rely on him the most.
okay.
When everything's calm and predictable, it's easy to just rely on ourselves.
Right.
But when the storms hit, we're forced to cling to Jesus.
Okay. I'm starting to see where they're going with that.
Yeah.
It's not that chaos is the goal,
Right.
but it's the catalyst.
The catalyst for deeper faith.
Right.
One pastor even said that stepping into chaos with Jesus
Okay.
is safer than staying comfortably in the boat.
Wow.
It's like a paradox, right? Embracing the unknown
Yeah.
with faith actually leads to greater security.
Okay. That's making more sense now.
Yeah.
It's not that we go looking for the chaos.
Right.
But when it comes,
Yeah.
we can see it as an opportunity.
Opportunity for
Yeah.
growth.
Yeah.
And speaking of growth, let's talk about some of these sermon illustrations that stood out.
Okay.
Because a good illustration can really make a difference in
Yeah.
how a message lands.
Yeah. I'm always looking for good illustrations. What did you find?
So there was one pastor who used the video awareness test with the moonwalking bear
Oh, yeah. I've seen that one.
to illustrate how easy it is to miss the obvious when we're focused on the wrong things. You're supposed to be counting the basketball passes.
Right.
You miss the guy in the bear suit.
It's hilarious, but it's also kind of makes you think.
Yeah. And this pastor used that to show how the disciples were so focused on the storm, they completely missed Jesus walking towards them on the water.
That's clever. We can be so preoccupied with our anxieties and fears that we miss the miracles.
Exactly. And then another one, a pastor used a sky coaster ride to evoke the feeling of fear
Oh, wow.
Uncertainty that we experience in life. You know, that sudden drop, the wind rushing past you, and
Yeah.
he connected it to that moment when Peter starts to sing and he cries out to Jesus. That feeling of desperation.
We can all relate to that.
We've all had those moments,
Yeah.
and we feel like we're going under. And all we can do is cry out to Jesus for help.
And speaking of crying out for help, there was one pastor who used a really interesting illustration about his pet parakeet
Oh, yeah.
getting stuck in a ceiling fan.
Uh-oh.
But I can see how that would be a good analogy for feeling overwhelmed.
Right, and he talked about how frantic he felt trying to get the bird down, how helpless the parakeet was, just flapping its wings and
Yeah.
squawking.
Yeah.
And he compared that to how we feel in the storms of life, feeling out of control and desperate for someone to save us.
And that reminds us that Jesus is always there,
Yeah.
ready to rescue us
Yeah.
when we call out to him, no matter how chaotic things get.
Right. And speaking of chaos, understanding the historical context
Oh, yeah?
of this passage can really add another layer of depth to our understanding.
What did you find?
So several pastors pointed out that people in biblical times believed that the spirits of drowned people haunted the sea at night.
Oh, wow.
So imagine you're out on a stormy sea.
Yeah.
It's pitch black. You see a figure walking on the water.
Yeah, no wonder they thought it was a ghost.
Right. It adds a whole new dimension to their fear
Yeah.
and their reaction.
Right, they weren't just scared of the storm, they were scared of the supernatural.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important element that several pastors highlighted, the power of cross-references. Because when you can connect this passage to other scriptures, it really enriches your teaching
Yeah.
and helps your congregation see the bigger picture.
A good cross-reference can be like a light bulb moment. What were some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, a lot of the pastors reference Psalm 23.4, talking about God being with us even in the darkest valleys. It's a good reminder that even when we're facing our deepest fears, we're not alone. Jesus is right there with us.
It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah,
And it probably resonates with a lot of people, especially those who are going through difficult times.
absolutely. And then there was Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith chapter, all those biblical figures who trusted God, even when they couldn't see the results. It's a powerful reminder that faith isn't about seeing, it's about believing.
It's a really relevant message right, for today, when it's all about instant gratification and tangible evidence.
Yeah.
But faith is about trusting God even when we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And that's a message we all need to hear, especially when we're facing those storms that seem impossible to navigate.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Distracted commitment, stepping out in faith, finding faith in chaos, these amazing sermon illustrations, even the historical context and the cross-references. I'm feeling pretty inspired. How about you?
Definitely. It's amazing how a familiar passage like this can offer so many fresh insights when we dive deep.
Absolutely. But hold on to your hats, folks, because we're just getting started. In part 2, we're going to take an even closer look at how some specific pastors took this passage and really made it their own, crafting really unique and memorable sermons. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So let's get into some of these specifics of, how these pastors really dug into this passage and found some interesting angles.
Yeah, let's unpack some of these individual sermons, see what we can find, because that's where the real gold is, right? It's seeing how they took these broader themes
Exactly.
and crafted a message that really speaks to their congregation.
Absolutely. So, for example, there was a sermon from Atlanta Berean Church that really focused on the difference between praying and actually playing, their point being that true prayer involves stepping out in faith,
Okay.
just like Peter did when he got out of the boat.
So it's not just about asking for things.
Right.
It's being willing to participate in the answer.
Exactly. And they even tied it in with the historical context. Jesus sent the disciples out into the storm as a way to protect them from a potentially dangerous crowd on shore. So it wasn't just a random test of faith. It was a strategic move to keep them safe.
That's a good point. So it's not just blindly stepping out,
Right.
but it's trusting that Jesus has a plan,
Exactly.
even if we don't understand it.
And it leads to a really powerful point that this pastor made. Peace isn't about the absence of storms.
Right.
It's about finding peace in Jesus' presence, even when the storms are raging around you.
Okay, now that's a message that I think a lot of people need to hear.
Yeah.
Life is full of storms. But if we can find that peace
Right.
in the midst of the chaos, that's where true victory is.
Absolutely. Now, remember that snowboarding analogy we talked about?
Oh, yeah?
About keeping your eyes fixed as you're flying down the mountain?
Yeah.
That was from a sermon at Elon Church.
Okay.
And they really dug into that. comparing, focusing on Jesus to focusing on that fixed point. If
Yeah.
you take your eyes off of that, you're going to wipe out.
Yeah.
And they made it even more relatable by talking about how in life we often drift away from that focus gradually.
Right.
It's not always this sudden, crash and burn. It's this slow, subtle slide. Of course.
It's so true. We get distracted by the little things, the day-to-day stress,
Mm-hmm.
and before we know it, we've completely lost sight
Mm-hmm.
of what really matters.
And that's why it's so important to have those spiritual disciplines, in place.
Yeah.
Things like prayer, Bible study, fellowship,
Yeah.
to keep us centered.
Keep our focus on Jesus. Yeah. So tell me more about that sermon from Mount Pleasant Baptist Church
Oh, yeah.
that you mentioned, where they talked about the whole story being an analogy for the church.
Yeah, so they suggested that the image of Jesus walking on water represents him sending the church out into the world. We're the ones called to face the storms, but we're empowered by his presence to do the impossible.
I love that. It shifts the focus from just of our own personal faith journey
Yeah.
to the broader mission
Exact.
of the church. Like, yeah, we're facing rough seas,
Yeah.
but we're not in it alone. We're part of something bigger.
And it reminds us that we're not just called to survive the storms.
Right.
We're called to make a difference, be a beacon of hope.
Okay, now remind me about that Tohu Wabohu sermon that kind of blew your mind.
Oh, yeah, that was from Virginia Beach Potter's House. What was so cool about that was how they connected the chaos of the sea to that Hebrew phrase from Genesis,
Right.
where it describes the earth as being formless and void before God brought order to it.
So are they saying chaos is a good thing?
Not exactly. It's more like they're saying that Jesus sometimes leads us into these chaotic situations on purpose.
Yeah.
Because it's in those moments
Yeah.
that we're forced to rely on him,
Okay.
It's like he's saying, step out of your comfort zone into the messiness of life and trust me to guide you through it.
Okay, so it's not that the chaos is good,
Right.
but God can use it
Absolutely.
to shape us.
Right. Like a spiritual weightlifting session.
I like that. If we never face any challenges,
Yeah.
our faith never gets a chance to grow.
There was another sermon that took a really unique approach to the idea of crying out to Jesus. This one was from Triumph BHCC Media, and they distinguished between simply praying and actually crying out.
Okay, what's the difference?
So they were saying that crying out is more than just a polite request. It's like a raw, desperate plea
Yeah.
for help. It's that moment when you're at the end of yourself and all you can do is scream out to God for mercy.
It's like sometimes we try to be so proper and polite in our prayers, but there are times when all you can do is let out a primal scream.
And they argued that when we cry out to Jesus like that, we're demanding a response. Just like a baby cries out to its parent. It's not about being disrespectful. It's about expressing the depth of our need and our reliance on God.
And they pointed out that it's often in those moments of desperation that we experience the most profound breakthroughs. Like when we hit rock bottom, that's when we're finally open to receiving God's grace in a way that we never were before.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a crisis to shake us out of our comfort zone
Yeah.
and force us to really lean on God.
Now, speaking of leaning on God, there was a sermon from Northside Assembly that talked about enduring faith. And they said it's not just about that initial burst of faith when we first step out of the boat.
It's about sustaining that faith over time through all the ups and downs, the challenges and the setbacks.
Because faith isn't always easy.
Right.
There are going to be times when we doubt,
Yeah.
we question, we feel like giving up.
And this pastor used a really interesting analogy. He talked about two-step verification.
Oh, yeah.
You know how you have to verify your identity multiple times online these days?
Right.
He said, our faith is kind of like that. It needs to be verified and reaffirmed through those challenges and setbacks. It's the tests and trials that actually strengthen our faith,
Okay.
make it more resilient.
So each time we face a challenge and we come through it,
Yeah.
our faith gets a little bit stronger.
Now, what about this sermon from Underwood Baptist Church? They focused on Jesus's presence as a source of confidence.
Right.
Their point was, when we fixate on the storms around us, we lose sight of the one who has the power to calm them. It's like we get so caught up in the wind and the waves that we forget Jesus is right there, in the boat, with us.
It's so easy to do that, though, isn't it? When the storms are raging, it's hard to see anything else.
And they emphasized that Jesus doesn't just stand back and watch us struggle.
Right.
He actively confronts our fears and offers us his peace and strength.
So how do we shift our focus
Yeah.
from the storm to Jesus? especially when it feels like we're about to drown.
Well, this pastor talked about the importance of reminding ourselves of God's promises, meditating on Scripture, fixing our minds on things that are true and honorable, right, pure, lovely, admirable.
So it's about being intentional.
Yes.
It's about filling our minds
Absolutely.
with truth and hope, especially when the world is bombarding us
Right.
with so much negativity and fear.
Yeah. Now, there was a sermon that really got me thinking about how we perceive Jesus, even when we think we know him. This one was from PS 23 Church,
Okay.
and they pointed out that the disciples actually didn't recognize Jesus at first. They thought he was a ghost.
Wow. Do you think they would know their leader, right?
Right, but they were so terrified and caught up in the moment that they didn't even recognize him. And the pastor tied that back to how we often fail to recognize Jesus in our own lives, especially during those difficult times.
So how do we learn to recognize Jesus in the midst of the storm, when it's hard to see clearly?
Well, they talked about the importance of spiritual discernment, those eyes of faith,
Hmm.
that allow us to see beyond the surface
Hmm.
and recognize God at work, even in the chaos.
It's like sometimes God shows up in unexpected ways,
Yeah.
and we miss it
Yeah,
because we're not looking.
exactly. And they brought in that whole Emmaus story, where the disciples were walking with Jesus,
Right.
but they didn't recognize him.
Until he broke bread with them. Yeah.
So it's about being attentive,
Yeah.
paying attention
To the little details.
to those seemingly insignificant moments where God might be revealing himself to us.
It's true. Sometimes the most profound encounters with God happen in the most ordinary moments.
Now, speaking of everyday moments, let's talk about this sermon from Home Church that really tackled this whole idea of inconsistency in faith. And they used Peter's experience as a metaphor for the ups and downs that we all experience in our faith journey.
Yeah, because I think we could all relate to that. We have those moments of really strong faith. Like we can walk on water, but then we hit a rough patch and we start to sink.
And they made a really interesting point. Our level of faith often fluctuates depending on where we're focusing our attention. When we're focused on the storm, our faith tends to waver. But when we're focused on Jesus, our faith is strengthened.
Okay, so it's all about perspective. Where we choose to focus our attention makes all the difference.
Exactly. And they actually use a line graph to illustrate this.
Wow.
Showing how faith can go up and down.
Like a roller coaster.
Just like a roller coaster, depending on where our focus is.
That's great. I like that.
Now, this next sermon is one that I think a lot of pastors will appreciate because it deals with that whole what if question that we often get from people who are struggling.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the tough ones.
Yeah.
This was by Jason Baker, and he focused on the theme of fear versus faith. And he challenged listeners to think about the types of what if questions we ask ourselves. Are they driven by fear or by faith?
Because a lot of times our what ifs are rooted in anxiety and worry.
Right. And instead of saying, what if something bad happens, we can choose to ask, what if God uses the situation for good?
It's a subtle shift, but it's really powerful.
Yeah.
It's choosing to believe that God's working behind the scenes,
Exactly.
even when we can't see it.
It's about believing in God's goodness and power, even when circumstances seem bleak.
Wow, we've covered so much ground already. I am blown away by the creativity and the depth of these sermons. It's really inspiring to see how each pastor took this familiar story and they found a way to make it fresh and relevant for their congregation.
It's a great reminder that the Bible is a living, breathing book, and there's always something new to discover
Yeah.
in its pages.
And that even a passage like this, Matthew 14, 22-33, can still speak to us in new ways if we're willing to dive deep and listen for God's voice.
Absolutely. And speaking of diving deep, we've got one more part of this deep dive to go.
Okay.
In part 3, we're going to look at some of the most impactful illustrations and the practical takeaways from these sermons, so stay tuned.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The Matthew 14, 22-33. We've gone through some pretty profound themes, interpretations. And now I want to talk about those memorable sermon illustrations, the ones that really stick with people, after they've left the church.
Yeah, those little nuggets that, bring the message home.
Exactly. Make it relatable. Make it entertaining.
Yeah.
Remember that moonwalking bear video we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
You're so focused on counting the basketball passes that you miss the guy?
In the bear suit.
Yeah. That was from Oak Grove Baptist Church. Such a brilliant way to illustrate how easy it is to miss the obvious when our attention is misplaced.
It's a perfect analogy for the disciples. So focused on the storm, they completely miss Jesus walking towards them on the water.
Yeah.
We can be so consumed by our worries that we don't even see the miracles right in front of us.
And then there was that incredible parakeet story.
Oh, yeah.
Chippy.
Stuck in the ceiling fan.
Oh, that was from Grace Bible Church. And it really, you could just feel the panic and helplessness.
We're Chippy.
But then he connected that to our own struggles.
Yeah.
Feeling overwhelmed, needing rescue.
Yeah. It's that feeling of we need someone to save us.
Yeah.
We're in over our heads.
And no matter how crazy things get, Jesus is always there, ready to reach down, pull us out of the storm.
Speaking of relatable illustrations, the pastor from Reed Sport Church of God used a sky coaster ride to give that feeling of fear and uncertainty that we all face in life. Well, that was great. You get that sudden drop, the wind whipping past you. Yeah. You could practically feel the disciples' fear as they face the storm.
It was such a powerful way to highlight the contrast between fear and faith.
Yeah.
Even when we feel like we're plummeting towards disaster, Jesus is right there with us.
Yeah.
Holding on.
Yeah.
And then we had Mountain View Church using that imagery of being completely exhausted after a workout.
Yeah.
Physically spent
Yeah.
to describe spiritual depletion.
Yeah. It's such a relatable experience,
Yeah.
that feeling of being totally drained.
Yeah.
It really captures how life can leave us, feeling empty
Yeah.
spiritually.
But just like we need to catch our breath,
Right.
refuel after a tough workout,
Yeah.
we need to reconnect with Jesus, allow him to replenish us
Yeah.
spiritually.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners? What can pastors and Bible study leaders really glean from these sermons?
One of the things that kept coming up was the need to develop spiritual blinders. Just like how blinders help a horse stay focused on the path ahead. We need to find ways to filter out the distractions that can pull us away from Jesus.
Which makes me think about all the noise that we are bombarded with every day. Social media, the news, information overload. It's no wonder we feel lost and disoriented sometimes.
Yeah.
But what were some of the ways these pastors suggested we could cultivate these spiritual blinders?
Well, one pastor suggested, a daily soul detox.
Okay.
15 minutes of just being present, no phone, no input, quiet reflection. Another one had this rule of no news before Bible study, so they wouldn't let the events of the day color their interpretation.
Those are really practical. It's about being intentional with our time and our attention.
Absolutely.
Another key takeaway was the need to step out of our comfort zones.
Yes.
Time and again, these pastors emphasize that faith without action is incomplete.
Yeah, it's not just believing in Jesus, it's following him. Even when it's scary or uncertain, could mean taking a leap of faith, serving in a new way, saying yes to opportunities that you might feel underqualified for.
That leads right into the final takeaway. Embracing chaos as a potential catalyst for growth. These pastors really made a strong argument that when we face challenges, uncertainty, it can actually deepen our reliance on Jesus.
It's in those moments of chaos when we realize our own strength just isn't enough.
Yeah.
We discover the power of his grace.
So as you reflect on Matthew 14:22-33, consider this. Where do you need to develop those spiritual blinders to minimize those distractions? Are you willing to step out of that comfort zone? Take a risk for Jesus. And how can you reframe chaos? See it as a potential opportunity for spiritual growth.
Remember, even a little bit of faith, when focused on the eternal God, can move mountains.
Until next time, keep diving deep into the Word, and may your sermons be filled with fresh insights and engaging illustrations that inspire and transform lives.